Hi everyone, my name's Lois Beach. I am the consultancy and partnership manager at HousingLIN, and I'm very delighted to chair today and learn more about hospices, and go along with you all on that journey around what kind of good hospice design looks like in terms of the sort of bricks and mortar, but also the services that can be provided. I guess what I do know about hospices at the moment is that each year they provide support to the 300,000 people living with life-limiting or at end of life, and they also provide support to roughly 60,000 people through sort of counselling and other kind of support services. And it's predicted that actually by 2040, around 130,000 more people will die each year in the UK than today, which surely kind of indicates that if we get hospice design right, it can mean that a time that can actually can be quite horrible can actually be quite beautiful. And certainly that's the experience that I found where I've visited hospices myself, with as part of family situations. The design where it's really carefully considered can make such a big difference. So I really want to thank United St Saviour's for sponsoring this session and enabling us all to learn a bit more about what kind of good design looks like in this space. The three speakers we've got today are, so we've got Ken Worpole with us, who's the author of Modern Hospice Design, with the architecture of palliative and social care. So he's a writer and social historian. His work usually includes books around architecture, landscape and public policy. He's going to share the sort of new edition of that book, which advocates the need for good palliative care in hospices. We'll then follow by Alison Ben-Zimra, who's head of research and influence at United St Saviour's, which is an almshouse. And Alison has extensive experience in the ageing research field. She was the manager of the Whitney Foundation for Ageing Well, and she's also on the British Society of Gerontology's Emerging Researchers in Ageing Committee. She's going to share the experience of almshouses that are owned by United St Saviour's, including their new Appleby Blue scheme in Southwark, in supporting end of life. Whilst not necessarily a hospice, how elements of kind of hospice design and support can really be integrated into other types of accommodation too. And then lastly, we're joined by Mary Hutchinson, who's Associate Director, PRP, and Claire Cameron, who's a Director of Later Living and Care at PRP as well, both to kind of talk about the design at Rokoff in Torquay, which is a hospice that recently won a Housing Design Award, and that was in 2023. Talk us through kind of what good design looks like from Rokoff's perspective. So that's the kind of overview of what we're going to be talking about. Q&A will be at the end of each of the speakers, and I'll hand over to Ken first. Thank you, Ken.
Oh, sorry, Ken, I think you might be on mute.
You might need to unmute yourself, thanks.
Hello. Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Lois. Yes, I mean, I call myself a writer and social historian because it allows me really to do what I like, rather than being very specific. But I worked in the 1990s very much on parks and open air and libraries and the whole kind of social tissue of the modern town or city. Very interested in the role these places play for bringing people together. So I've always had this historic interest in places that act as meeting places, that are free at the point of use, and where people of different classes, different cultures, different backgrounds can meet in an atmosphere relatively of mutual respect and so on. I became very interested in cemeteries, and I'm married to a photographer, and we did spend about 8 years of holidays going around Europe in the 1990s and early 2000s, photographing cemeteries. And I published a book in 2002 called Last Landscapes, the architecture of the cemeteries in modern European life. And after that, someone got in touch with me from the Irish Hospice Foundation. The director there had been particularly interested in some of the things I'd said in the book about cemeteries, about attitudes to death in different cultures, particularly Northern Europe and Southern Europe, Catholic Protestant, because he felt that this was very germane to some of the specific problems that Ireland had with religion and dying and kind of approaches to a more secular kind of response to dying. And so they commissioned me to go with him. And we travelled around UK, we went to Norway and Sweden and looked and visited and talked to people running hospices there and came back. And it was clear that Britain was seen as the model. The UK really was seen as the model of what I think we all now call the modern hospice movement. And I'm interested in models because as an outsider to architecture, I've always been troubled by the fact that there always seem to be so few models of very successful things. And if I'm talking to people about public health or reading books about public health, I'm very soon zoomed down to the Peckham Health Centre in the 1930s or to the Finsbury Health Centre in the late 1930s as models of where architecture responded to a new kind of need for public health and community, actually. And in a way, that's what the role that when Dame Cicely Saunders established the health centre in Sydenham, St Christopher's in 1967, she created a model that literally transformed ways of thinking about throughout the world. So if we look at the first slide, please, that would be great. Yeah, the first edition of this book was specifically about hospices, and that was published by Routledge in 2009. On the right, you see the facade of the new hospice in Sydenham, designed by Smith and Henry. And before Dame Cicely Saunders opened this, she went to work in one of the very early established and very famous London hospices, which was in Victoria Park, near Victoria Park. And she worked there. That was also, if we look at the next slide, St Joseph's Hospice. That was where Cicely Saunders went to work to find out herself how hospices worked. It was a religious hospice. It was run by nuns. But she got the feeling, and anybody who lives in Hackney will have that feeling, that St Joseph's wasn't simply a building. It had a tremendous kind of moral presence, you might say, in the East End of London, because it was largely used, it was opened in 1907, it was largely used by Irish men who lived on their own in the East End, who'd come over to work in the docks or in the building trade, who often lived on their own in very poor accommodation, and at the end of life found a degree of kind of respite and love, strangely, in a place for the dying. And it's that notion of this kind of building occupying a space in the town or city that took me greatly when I first visited Sydenham. And I've used this metaphor, well, it's not my metaphor, it's from a poem by Philip Larkin, who describes, although he was not a believer, it's called Church Going, and he goes to an abandoned church, he takes his cycle clips off, and yet he feels a presence there. And he describes it as the one serious building on earth. And I've come to think now in the modern, more secular world, that the hospice has become that serious building, occupying that kind of space, which is not religious, but it's certainly a mixture of the ethereal, the palliative, the caring, and a place of love. So we'll go to the next slides if we can. That was very traditional hospices. St Christopher's was inpatient. It had 3 walls of 18 patients each, and it was a very quiet kind of retreat. And that was the original model that Cicely Saunders wanted, a place of quiet, largely for people in the last few weeks, if not days of their lives, and mostly on the understanding that once you went in, you didn't come out again, and that the palliative care was both a combination of very clever and modulated pain relief through drugs, but also a very strong kind of Christian, although it was a secular, anybody was able to go there, but a very strong sense of the love of other people for those in the last days or hours of their lives. But those two things kind of always imbue the atmosphere of a hospice. But then I went up to Newcastle to see a couple of hospices, one by Jane Derbyshire, who practiced JDDK, has now made quite a practice of designing hospitals. And there I met an architect there called Ian Clark, and he made a great impression on me, and he kind of opened my eyes to the way in which already, this one, St Oswald's, was only opened in 1987, so that's 20 years after Sydenham. Very different ethos. It was designed really to be much more open to the outside world as a place where people would come and go. And largely this was achieved by offering both day patient services and outpatient services. And day patients would come in and do complementary therapy classes, do a bit of exercises, counselling, and this notion that the building was moving from being a retreat from the community into a place that worked for the community became very interesting. And if we go to the next slide, this was Ian Clark. I get very upset. He killed himself in 2015, died by his own hand. And I really liked Ian a lot, and he taught me so much. But he was wonderful in writing about the design of hospices, as we shall see if we go to the next slide. This was something that Ian wrote in a very important essay called Building with Feeling. The design of the environment can make the journey through the building feel like one through a characterful village, incorporating distinct and legible places with, importantly, the essential thresholds or buffers between them, which assist in our knowing where we are and what sort of behaviour is appropriate in our progressive journey. Why can we not get away from the ubiquitous no-place hospital corridors that we are so used to, which often feel like monotonous human vectors or motorways, simply terminating at the patient bed, almost as if they were an arbitrary destination? And this notion of the living village, which I first heard from Ian, has since kind of really, to me, symbolised the role of the modern hospice. And of course, there are now nearly 240 of them in the UK. So it is true that most towns and cities, and sometimes even very small towns, will have a hospice. And it's now occupying this kind of space, which is quite unique, really, which we didn't have at the beginning of the 19th century, and until the 1960s. Okay, if we go to the next slide. The last slide from a hospice this is a new hospice, St Wilfrid's Hospice. It celebrated its 10th year in January this year. It's in Eastbourne, designed by PRP Architects, and this is the entrance. It's, by the way, it's in its own landscape gardens, but it's only 100 yards from a large Sainsbury's with a very large, even larger car park. And the atrium, or the entrance hall, has been designed as a street in a way. And this is actually one of its quieter times. When I first went there, it was lunchtime and the place was thronging. So it really is a very soft entrance into the building because of people. Again, it's this notion of people coming and going and chatting. And it's a marvelous design because if you're coming through those doors and you're facing the other way, you walk to the end. And through design, in one way, you can go into the clinical section. In another way, you can go into a rather beautiful landscape orchard garden at the back. There are 6 different types of gardens surrounding this building, but it is used intensely both by, obviously, visitors to the patients, to family members of patients, and to people calling by just to have a coffee, because it's a very amenable place near the supermarket. But also there are events there as well. So that it's kind of, they've humanized the relationship between the building and the community. So if we go to the next slide. So in the second edition, then I wanted to kind of expand the way of, or the range of buildings that are now thinking about people in very vulnerable circumstances, in difficult circumstances, but using architecture to kind of find a new relationship, both with the very serious issues of life and death and community. And of course, Maggie's is one of the most famous. It was set up, Maggie Keswick-Jenks herself died in 1995. The first Maggie's Centre was opened in 1996. And they are cancer care centres, they're non-residential. People go in there to sit and talk. They're always located in the car parks and oncology unit. And Amanda Levy told me the story about how they finally got permission to build the Maggie's. The community wanted one in the grounds of a rather grim, very large hospital in Southampton. And there was a very strong committee in favour of it, but the hospital authorities said they couldn't accept the offer of a paid building like that because they would lose car parking spaces. And Amanda Levy said, well, look, if I can reconfigure your car park to give you the same number of spaces, but a new building, would you accept that? And they did. So if we go to the next slide. And the key thing about the mega centres, as I say, they're not residential, they're drop-in centres. People have to be attending the oncology unit in the hospital in which they're located. But it's very much a place based around the notion of the kitchen table, of sitting and talking. And the cleverness of this particular design is that there are no doors in the building, but there are lots of niches, very quiet places where people go and sit one-to-one and chat through simply the ways of blocking sight lines and so on. So it's extremely clever. And the other thing about Maggie's is that there is no notice boards anywhere. And Maggie's thing was, if you can't tell where to go in a building, then the architect has failed. Okay. Oh, by the way, the last one, Maggie and Charles Jenks used the expression of what they thought the description of what Maggie's building should be. It was that it was a building that rises to the occasion. I think it's a lovely phrase because we don't know what the occasion is. We have to make up that occasion for ourselves, but that's what it is. It's a building that rises to the occasion. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, let's jump that one. That's not turned out. Okay. Right, we're now moving on to the world of almshouses, which goes back to 900 in this country. It's a very, very long established tradition, a religious tradition, and it had a distinctive kind of long-standing architectural style, which was to be a setback set of small cottages with gardens and often a gatehouse in front and a common dining room. But it was, again, in a way, something like the early hospices. It was set back, it was a retreat from the way of life. And these are very architecturally very distinctive. People, they're often sometimes the most beautiful building in a small town or a city. But in recent years, there has been a new attempt to kind of reinvent it. And obviously, we're going to hear much more from Alison about Appleby Blue, but I feel very honoured and pleased to have been involved in it from the start, because I have, over the last 20 years, worked on and off with Stephen Witherford and William Mann on various urban projects, but really all of us thinking that, urban life has to be for everybody. We can't just ship people out of the town or city as and when we need them to be kind of locked up or got out of the way. And that has been, sadly, the case with many buildings. I will shortly finish. Next slide, please. Yeah, so architectural critic Carolyn Steele, Appleby Blue exudes a quality that all great buildings share, a sense of humanity that reminds us of what all architecture is ultimately about, helping people to lead good lives. Next slide, please. The last one is Lark Hill Retirement Village. It's run by Coventry Churches Housing Association. Well, that's the Extra Care Trust now, grew out of Coventry Churches Housing Association. They have 16 living villages, and they're all multi-occupied, multi-use, mixture of social housing and private, but they're very strong emphasis on activities, and they research the health benefits of people living in these villages. I've been to them and they're fantastic. Next slide, please. That's just one block. There are all kinds of different blocks in the Nottingham one. 327 homes, 470 residents, all of whose health seems to be improving as a result of moving there. Okay, we're nearly there. Yeah. Next slide. Okay, well, there was one got lost. Well, I will just say that I was noted in the Observer on Sunday. There was an article about children's homes, and it said that, and I'm quoting, a rise in children being housed hundreds of miles from their families with private provision, clustering in cheaper parts of the country. And that, I think, is a great dilemma that faces us, that in order to provide care on the cheap, we are decanting people out of the places they lived in a lot of their lives. And whether this applies to children or older people. And what I think Appleby Blue shows that there is a model for doing things with real quality back in the communities where people live. And that's the new cover of the book. And that's a very good report recently published on almshouses. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Ken. That's really great to have a kind of bit of an overview of the range of different types of hospices out there. So that's brilliant start. For sake of time, I'll hand over to Alison now. I'm just going to give you, I know Ken's already touched on Appleby Blue, but we'll give you the kind of Appleby Blue perspective to sort of supporting end of life. Alison.
Thanks, Lois. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Is it on present mode?
Yeah,
Yep.
It's on full screen mode.
Full screen mode, perfect. Thank you. So thanks so much, Lois, and Ken, thank you so much for that informative introduction. As Lois mentioned, I'm Alison Ben Zimmerer. I'm Head of Research at United St Saviour's charity. The charity has been providing almshouses for older people since the 16th century, and this has been driven by our organization's core value that your last home can be your best home. We manage 130 homes across 3 sites. Today, I'm going to be specifically talking about the design of Appleby Blue and our newest almshouse, which is our newest almshouse, and then the resident support model, which covers all 3 of our schemes. So Appleby Blue, as Ken mentioned, is designed by Stephen Witherford of Witherford, Watson and Mann, and it provides 57 homes. It still maintains the traditional almshouse characteristics of that courtyard design, which enables social interaction and reduces isolation. What is particularly noteworthy is the wide walkway. So none of the homes have the private balconies. So these communal balconies is where residents can sit and enjoy each other's company and share a cup of tea. As Ken mentioned, unlike other almshouses, the communal spaces are brought to the high street. So there's a real sense of vibrancy between what's happening in the almshouse and passerbys on the street. In keeping with the notion of the kitchen being the heart of the home, Appleby Kitchen and Community Centre is accessible to the wider community. So the building really is an asset to the community, and through that facilitates intergenerational engagement. What I find particularly special about Appleby Blue is the warmth and texture that the wood creates, and that the natural light streaming through the windows creates a welcoming winter garden atmosphere throughout the building. And Ken, I'm really pleased that we chose the same image, because I think what really makes a building is the people who live and work in it. When Stephen Weatherford speaks about first joining the initial workshop that the trustees hosted in 2012 to think of Appleby Blue, what he says what was unique was that no one spoke about the actual building, but rather how the building could create a sense of community. And a year on from opening Appleby Blue, it's been so rewarding to see these friendships blossom and a sense of neighborliness between the residents. There really is a sense of belonging. So I have to admit, I felt slightly daunted preparing for this webinar. Up until now, so much of my presentations have been focusing on this brand new shiny building. But being asked to speak with Ken and the other experts on the panel really allowed me to have incredibly powerful and insightful conversations with my colleagues. So much of what I'm going to tell you today is actually a reflection of these conversations and how these personal stories fit within the bigger picture of the health and care system. Shortly after joining the charity, we were invited to Weatherford, Watson and Mann for a presentation, and this is when I first met Ken and Professor Juliet Davis, who's an architect professor at Cardiff University, and she presented the findings of her book, The Caring City, Ethics of Urban Design. And it was through having these conversations around the theoretical notion of care in an urban environment where I really realized the thought and consideration that had gone into the design of Appleby Blue. And this consideration was maintained throughout the construction and even to when we moved residents in one day at a time to ensure that they receive that person-centered support. The innovation of the design of Appleby Blue is integrated into the innovation of our resident support model, and this covers all of our almshouses. So I'm going to tell you about 2 residents who have passed away and the journey that we went on with them. I'm not using their real names, and you will notice that their stories are different, but I believe that they highlight the issues of end-of-life care and support within the larger system. So the first is Tom, and Tom was one of the first residents to move into Appleby Blue, and he had multiple health complications. However, he had a very supportive and devoted daughter. She settled him into his new home. She made his flat really personal with all of his belongings, and he was surrounded by family photographs, and on his bedside table was the wedding photo of he and his late wife. Our resident support team had daily contact with the family. His family stayed over with him, and he was surrounded with his family up until his last moments. Although his last weeks were at Appleby Blue, his daughter said that they were lived in joy. He particularly enjoyed eating his breakfast on the bench outside his flat and looking out over the rooftop garden. We were all sad when Tom passed away, and although he only lived at Appleby for 6 weeks, we were comforted to know that he and his family felt supported and that he had a good quality of life. Mr. Wong's story is in contrast with Tom, as Mr. Wong had no family. Mr. Wong was originally from China and he spoke limited English. He was receiving kidney dialysis, and as he was still being treated, he didn't receive the beneficial palliative care soon enough. Speaking to Debbie about Mr. Wong's end-of-life journey, and Debbie is our resident support officer, she highlighted the complications that she ran into because she wasn't his next of kin. Debbie described it as having her hands tied and that there were assumptions being made on his behalf. He did have 4 carers a day for 15 minutes, but as she described, through no fault of their own, they were following the rules, and especially when it came to his diet. So Debbie knew that Mr. Wong liked oranges, and she made sure that he had oranges to eat. She also made sure that he had Chinese food because that was his preference. Debbie was able to provide this person-centric support to Mr. Wong, but at the same time, she told me how worried she was about him when she left work, and that she was worried that no one was with him after hours. There are currently 1 million people aged over 65 who do not have children, and that figure is set to double by 2030. So it's inevitable that cases like Mr. Wong are only going to increase. So as an arms house, we need to navigate the system and we need to figure out where we are located in this roadmap. So United St Saviour's, we're not a care home, we're not CQC regulated, we do not have 24-hour staff on site. So it really emphasizes the importance of us working with family, with social services, and with the NHS. And we do try work closely with GP practices. And to be honest, some GP practices we have better communication channels with than others. And often GPs themselves are uncertain of the next steps, and GPs are often the ones who will refer a resident to a hospice. As Ken mentioned, St Christopher's Hospice in Sydenham is the hospice that we would access, but they service 5 boroughs in London, so you can imagine the restraint on their capacity and resources. The system can be a bewildering maze, and as I've described, it can be challenging for our team to ensure the residents are receiving the appropriate care and support. So how do we support everyone in this process of death and dying? With support for the family, our resident support team are there for the family to chat with, and most importantly, to vent to. We're in the position to ease the load. And I think it's important to remember, even for family, it can be difficult because they're working. So a lot of them worry about whether the carer has showed up or whether their loved one has eaten lunch. With regards to resident support, we're aware that even if a resident does have family, we can't assume that the family have good intentions or will even step up when the help is needed. In terms of residents without family, we really have to act as their advocate. And we need to weigh up what someone wants with what we can offer. And we need to take into consideration the safety of the individual. And ultimately, we need to figure out what is the level of support that we can provide without the detriment to our other residents. And having these conversations with colleagues has really made me reflect on how we need to support our support team. How do we enable them to have these conversations with residents, friends, and family? Staff get to know residents so well and they really do care for them. So even when their death is expected, it still comes as a shock. It's a loss for our team, and they question what they could have done better. So as a charity, what's been really insightful in preparing for this presentation is reflecting on how we can support them. And then I suppose, how can we support the system? What can we do in our own way to be part of the solution? And by being involved in knowledge exchange activities such as happy hour and bringing professionals together across these sectors. It's in creating these bridges that ultimately leads to better outcomes for our residents. So in reflection and preparing for today's happy hour, I have to say that I'm extremely proud to work with Weatherford, Watson and Mann. I'm incredibly honored to be aligned with Ken Worpole's insightful work. I am privileged to work with my colleagues at United St Saviour's Charity, and I am so grateful to get to know our residents and their families. As Atul Gawande says in his book, Being Mortal, our ultimate goal, after all, is not about a good death, but a good life to the very end. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Alison. That was really beautiful. I'll hand over to Mary and Claire just for sake of time again, but yeah, we'll take some questions at the end.
There we go. So thank you for the quick introduction, Lois. That was I mean that still enjoying your talks of earlier, but I'm here today with Claire Cameron. We are from PRP Architects, and as a practice, we're known for our work in housing, including estate regeneration and master planning new neighbourhoods. But our work in the specialist housing team is designing for people in their later lives, and sometimes with a care need. And this is our team. We're all very passionate about the work that we do, and this is reflected in the time we've spent together designing many specialist housing models. And part of our experience is in designing for people with life-limiting conditions through hospice design. And our project here for St Anne's Hospice is now under construction, and the scheme for Rowcroft that I'll be talking about has received a unanimous planning approval. And we've got more designs at early stages in the pipelines too. So today I'm here to share one part of the designs at Rowcroft Hospice. Our client is a charity who provide hospice care to the whole of South Devon, both on-site in their inpatient and outpatient units, and outreach care to people's own homes. They're extremely well regarded and well known for their work. And this site in Torquay is a hilltop setting. There are long-reaching views to the sea, and it truly is a beautiful landscape. And so early on in the process, we met with each of the support groups for the charity, the local community, the amazing volunteers, and the Rowcroft employees. And this was a really insightful engagement. We learned about the site, how it was used and operated, but most of all, we learned about the love and the community that surrounded this charity. Everyone had a special story to tell about their journey with Rowcroft, and it was interesting to hear how much support there was for the redevelopment. And this was because overall, it was about the longevity of the hospice.
Sorry, Mary, could I interrupt you? Are your slides being shown? I think there's a couple of comments in the chat box that we can't see them.
Let me try again. It does say.
Ah, yeah, perfect. We can see them now. Thank you.
Are we okay to carry on from here? Is that all right?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Sorry, everyone. So everyone had a special story to tell us about their journey with Rowcroft. And it was interesting to hear how much support there was for this redevelopment. And that was because overall it was about the longevity of the hospice. The new development was happening to provide funds for the charity going forward. And this was essential to maintain this provision of care in South Devon. And one important message that we heard about the site was that patients in the IPU were no longer able to see the sea because of the maturity of the trees. They were planted more than 100 years ago, and the setting was now heavily screened at ground level. We also identified the user groups for each of the different building typologies that were being considered. And here we can see those people and their anticipated mobility: the hospice, the nursing home, and the independent living apartments. And it's significant to recognise that many patients staying in the inpatient unit, the hospice, will spend most of their day in bed, and their comfort and ease of movement, their mobility, requires bed movements both inside and out. The existing buildings on the site are an emblem for the charity. In the existing setting, Rainbow House is where the management team, the fundraisers, and the teaching school are all operated from. And Main House has the inpatient unit, operating as small wards on the ground floor, and the medical teams have offices upstairs. While the buildings are much loved, there is a need for refurbishment and modernisation. So our concept for the whole site is about designing a purposeful way of living that engages with the landscape setting. We wanted to provide connections through the landscape where each of the user groups on the site can come together and make the landscape setting work hard to provide opportunities for engagement, play, fun, and for an active intergenerational lifestyle. And to have an understanding of the scale of the whole site, these are all of the parts for the wider development. From the top, we can see an IRC, an integrated retirement community, providing assisted living apartments arranged as pavilions in the landscape and set around Rainbow House. And then the nursing home for people living with dementia and complex needs. And the design is set around households of 10 that reflects on having sociable and purposeful opportunities in and around a beautiful village green. And here at the village centre is a pavilion with a cafe and nursery. In the first instance, the nursery will serve the employees at the site and support care workers on shift timescales. And the client is also exploring how the nursery can bring communities together in this intergenerational setting. But Main House is retained and refurbished as the familiar face of the hospice, with a new inpatient unit, an IPU, extending into the landscape behind. We've brought all of the staff working for the hospice together to be more integrated and be one family. So I'm going to focus now on the hospice design. And I'll begin with the typology. So this is our ensuite bedroom. We've designed, and it's been designed to support a high level of nursing care. And the nursing care experience for the patients is respectful and discreet. The hospital level of services are kept out of sight in cupboards and behind curtains. And there's a daybed for guests to be comfortable during long visits. Together, these elements have been designed to have a domestic look and feel and not a scary hospital setting. An interesting anecdote that arose from the consultation is that not all patients have family and friends to visit. And in those cases, a modern single room can be a lonely place. So we've designed a couple of the rooms to be flexible. These can be opened up with a sliding pocket door and be interconnecting, effectively creating a mini ward with 2 beds side by side, but still retaining their own private bathrooms. And patients here can chat and have company if that's what they'd prefer. Importantly, all patients also have bed access out onto a private outside terrace to be able to sit under cover and enjoy the beautiful setting. And that extends into the garden. From the outset, we wanted each patient to have full access around the hospice building via their beds. And this was, of course, provided inside, but we also wanted the patient to experience the beautiful landscape gardens, remembering, of course, the challenging topography that we have at the site here at Rowcroft. So Main House is the familiar front of house and entrance of the hospice. Family, friends and staff will enter through the front door of the old house into a comfortable reception area and cafe. And these spaces lead onto the outpatient facilities, so the therapy suites, and upstairs we have the educational suite and all the staff offices and meeting rooms required for the operation of the hospice. Part of this accommodation is contained within a new 3-storey extension behind the existing building. And to the left, you can see the new inpatient unit extension. It's respectful in scale to the original building and provides a linked but independent suite of accommodation. Each bay that you can see on the elevation is one of the care bedrooms and their external terrace space. The patient entrance, which is likely arriving by ambulance, is discreetly located on the lower level, taking advantage of the site topography. And a bed lift is provided to all levels of the IPU. You can see the top floor of Main House has a viewing watch, which has amazing panoramic views and across Tor Bay. And we wanted to create the same experience for the patients, to have a quiet escape to the upper level, where you can see views of the sea and maybe also have an opportunity for stargazing at night. So this is a site-specific design that is truly magical. And as I'm sure you'll all appreciate, the brief and schedule of accommodation is complex. And we've noted the main rooms at each level of the building on the floor plans here. I don't have time to explain the nuances of all the secret back corridors and service routes, but safe to say the building manages the topography to its advantage, having ancillary surfaces at the subterranean lower level, and the private spaces of the IPU are set back from the front elevation and entrance of the original Main House at ground floor level. The special features of note are having a viewing room with a private connection to the landscape, where friends and relatives can pay their last respects, and the beautiful lantern with the roof terrace access at first floor. This is where you will also find the guest overnight accommodation for family wanting to stay close by. The upper levels of Main House will provide office spaces and working environments for more than 100 employees. And taking a closer look at the IPU, you can see that it's arranged in a way that the bedrooms, shown in purple, all open onto an open plan communal space, so patients and visitors can choose to come out of their private rooms and socialise if they wish. The communal space has a connection to nature with the Lightwell garden and also a communal kitchen with a large kitchen table. A simple gesture where people are comfortable in coming together for peer support and a chat. And this is the view from the south looking up to the inpatient unit. You can see the sweeping pathways in the landscape that make accessible connections for patients. The landscape has been designed so it can be appreciated at different heights, thinking about people in wheelchairs, walking with assistance and from a bed. The rooftop garden and lantern are just peeping over the parapet above the IPU. And this is the private roof terrace and special space for the use of patients, giving them the views of the sea that we were asked to provide in the first community engagement event. And beyond the hospice, the landscape opens to the village centre, where our purposeful activities will engage with the wider Roadcroft community. Main House is just to the left of this image and Rainbow House to the right. The nursing home and pavilions are at the heart of the village centre. So this is the nursing home set around the village green. And Rainbow House with the assisted living beyond. That's all, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mary. And I think, all of those presentations have actually, there's been some really beautiful examples in there. It's actually quite emotional to kind of see, the power of those images and what can actually be provided. Makes you, it makes you tear up a little bit. But yeah, I've noted that there aren't that many questions, or there aren't any questions in the Q&A box. So if anybody has any that they want to ask in the last sort of 10 minutes, please do put them in there. If not, I'm happy to kind of provide some questions. So as you guys were all kind of talking, one of the things that I was thinking about is, what kind of some of the most effective design features that kind of make people really feel at home within the hospice settings. I know, Ken, I really loved that kind of that phrase, the sort of characterful village that you use from Ian. And I wondered, whether people would just be able to sort of touch upon what they think are the kind of most effective design features that help people to feel at home within a kind of hospice. I don't know, each of you could potentially answer that, but maybe, Ken, do you want to go first, and then I'll move on to others. To unmute yourself. Oh, you need to unmute yourself, Ken, sorry.
Yes, it is related to this question, which is the much bigger issue of all the projects we've looked at have been from the independent, charitable, not-for-profit, either religious or communitarian projects. And that's where innovation comes from. We have a problem that actually the scale of care for the old and vulnerable and so on is going to be enormous, as you said right at the beginning, Lois.
Yeah.
It's how we transfer these lessons without becoming, because once you bring in NHS or government protocols on design something, so many things go out the window, and characterfulness would be one of them. And I just think this is the next big project we have to talk about. How do you infiltrate the NHS and the private care sector as well with these lessons?
It's a really good point. Yeah, I think Alison, did you want to come in? Sorry.
Just in terms of that sense of belonging, what has really been kind of eye-opening for me is really the notion of the kitchen being the heart of the home. And I know that Ken mentioned that with one of the sites. Having the community kitchen where people can come and make a cup of tea and share a meal, and it really is a place of gathering. And so it is a place where what is fantastic about the design of Appleby Blue is that those thresholds of sociability. So if you're wanting to be in your own home, you have that, but you can still see down into the courtyard. And if you're wanting to be engaged, you come down and you can be part of that community space inside the kitchen. And I think that's what's embodying that sense of belonging.
Could I add something to that?
Yeah, please do.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, it's just that when Steve and I and William were going around a number of care homes, some very good, very expensive, and so on, and also in my own personal experience with other relatives, we often would come across a very large, beautifully appointed lounge, completely empty, and this is another big issue. I mean, how do you animate or activate a very large lounge? And I think the community kitchen has to be, and that does require a different attitude to people there. That they're not just, it's not a hotel where you sit there quietly and die of boredom. I mean, it has to, they have to be able to make their own tea, or people have to cook for others. And it was true that these lounges are some are beautifully appointed, and they can seat 100 in kind of sit back beautiful armchairs, and they're always empty.
Yeah, that we tend to find that it's the case along lots of the sort of housing for older people that we sort of visit within the HousingLIN. But I think often the design is so important, and Mary and Claire, you probably know a lot more about it than I do, but to me, kind of big mass open spaces are just not very inviting. So having spaces that are kind of broken up and really encourage people to kind of organically move through them really helps with that. I don't know, Mary and Claire, did you want to, there are some questions in the chat, but did you want to come back on any of the things that around the important aspects that help people feel at home at Rowcroft, or any other comments so far?
Yeah, I was just going to say, touching on something Ken said earlier about removing corridors and kind of deinstitutionalizing the building, dehospitalizing it by designing in groups, like our little Rowcroft cluster with bedrooms around a central space and the family kitchen, rather than those corridors. And also the choice of materials. When we first went to Rowcroft, as it is now, there was a lot of concern about germs and not using wood because of impregnation. And actually, we've overcome all of those things through careful, specifying and visiting other buildings and finding out that you can actually use domestic materials and lots of timber, like Appleby Blue. So yes, that's all I was going to add.
Yeah, so I think Alison, you sort of touched on it. That sort of sense of nature for people at end of life is crucially important. I know I'm kind of thinking about my grandpa, who always says to me, "Oh, I'm so happy, Lois, that you put up that bird feeder outside my window." Every time I see him, he says exactly the same thing. But actually, it's because it's so important to him to have that connection to the nature and the outside. You sort of think, "Oh, he's going to say it again," but the reason he's saying it is because he genuinely thinks it's helping his everyday life. So I'm thinking it's probably the same case for Tom, Alison, in the example you gave, who's sat looking outside at the beautiful landscapes, gardens at Blue as well. And I know there's a question from Claire about those gardens, so maybe I'll segue into that nicely. I think you had a question, Claire, about the open corridors that I think they're closed, aren't they? Whether there are any kind of planting or fire safety arrangements around the furniture and planting that are provided or can't be provided within those corridors. Alison, you're able to sort of share.
So there are restrictions on what residents are able to personalize their outdoor front door area. So unfortunately, due to fire regulations, we can't have no doormats or wreaths on the door. There are planters outside each home, and so residents can plant those planters up. Again, it needs to be in non-flammable pots, so ceramic and no plastic plants and stuff like that. So obviously, due to fire regulation, that is the case. Everything is treated, so all the benches, all the planters, all the wood is treated and fixed. But it is incredible how residents have been able to personalize the space given those restrictions anyway. It doesn't have to be cheap flammable materials.
Yeah. And I guess that kind of personalization, I was thinking about that when you were speaking, sort of Claire and Mary. Are there ways that sort of people can personalize Rowcroft as well, the rooms, or are they quite Is it quite sort of set in stone about what you can do?
No, not at all. They, as a charity, they were very open to people bringing whatever they wanted to bring. It could be belongings, it could be clothing, and even pets were welcome.
Lots of space to do one.
There was space to be able to bring family in and enjoy the landscape. They were quite happy for you know, young children to come and play outside, and I think it was about being as normal as possible. They often said to us that they didn't want to be the place on the hill that people would go to die. They very much more wanted to be able to have a conversation about dying and be able to live your best life.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we often kind of, you know, shy away from those conversations, don't we? But actually, you know, lots of the research that we do with old people indicates that people actually, they want to talk about it. It's you know, it's a fact of life. So yeah, thank you for answering that. There's a couple of other questions. There's one from George McGuinness in the chat, which I think might be best directed at you again, those from PRP, around, you know, what wider factors are critical in making a well-designed hospice viable. So I guess this is in relation to kind of, you know, costs and affordability. Is there, you know, it's quite a large question there. Were there things that kind of help to support the viability at low cost?
So I know that there are some grants that they can apply for to help build the hospice, but I think one of the biggest lessons learned in spending time with this charity is the enormous amount of work that needs to be done behind the scenes to raise funds. So much of the care and the money that they need to provide the service is from their own fundraising activities and the support that they have that way. And they have started, you know, they've started fundraising to build Rowcroft. It's all underway.
But within the design, we do look to be really efficient in terms of as much standardization as we can, as much stacking as we can, and we, you know, we work really closely with the cost consultant on the way through. And we, whilst the space is kind of generous, we did have a bit of a value engineering exercise to sort of pull it back and make sure that it would be deliverable, and compared it to other brand new hospices in the country and to see what they were doing, so that we weren't getting carried away, as it were.
Well, thank you. And I've seen another question come through in the chat instead of the Q&A box around how easy it is to kind of get planning for particular, it says these projects, but I don't know, maybe Alison, do you want to talk a little bit about the kind of the sort of how Appleby Blue, I guess, came about? I think I know a bit about that, but I'll leave it to you to explain, maybe.
So it was a result of a Section 106. Appleby used to be, it's a council owned land, and there was a derelict care home on the site. It got to the point where there were even squatters in the building. So a private developer, part of their planning permission was to build affordable housing. And because the council had this site, even though it was off-site of the private development, and it was a care home originally, that's where United St Saviour's came on board. And it's an exemplar in terms of the council, independent charity, a private developer, and an architect practice working together to really see a vision come to fruition.
Thanks, Alison. That's great. Is there any other kind of comments? I'm conscious we're at 5. Any other comments or last reflections that speakers you'd like to make before we close? It's been really, really helpful for me, really informative to understand more about kind of, yeah, the hospice movement, but also how organisations generally are supporting people in end of life. So really want to thank all of you for kind of coming and sharing your knowledge with us. And next, I think there's a break next week from happy hour, because we've got the sort of COH conference next week. But we'll be back the following week. So yeah, please do sign up for future happy hours. And it's been great to chair the session. And thanks everyone. Have a really great evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.